Chapter 6 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 6, The Hampton Roads Conference. With this double-meaning credential, the commissioners presented themselves at the Union lines near Richmond on the evening of January 29, 1865, and instead of frankly showing their authority, asked admission in accordance with an understanding claimed to exist with Lieutenant General Grant on their way to Washington as peace commissioners. The application being telegraphed to Washington, Mr. Stanton answered that no one should be admitted under such character or profession until the President's instructions were received. Mr. Lincoln, being apprised of the application, promptly dispatched Major Thomas T. Eckert, an officer of the War Department, with written directions to admit the commissioners under safe conduct if they would say in writing that they came for the purpose of an informal conference on the basis of his note of January 18 to Mr. Blair, with the view of securing peace to the people of our one common country. Before this officer arrived, however, the commissioners reconsidered the form of their application and addressed a new one to General Grant, asking permission to proceed to Washington to hold a conference with President Lincoln upon the subject of the existing war, and with the view of ascertaining upon what terms it may be terminated in pursuance of the course indicated by him in his letter to Mr. Blair of January 18, 1865. Pursuant to this request, they were provisionally conveyed to Grant's headquarters. One of them records with evident surprise the unostentatious surroundings of the General in Chief. I was instantly struck with the great simplicity and perfect naturalness of his manners, and the entire absence of everything like affectation, show, or even the usual military air or mien of men in his position. He was plainly attired, sitting in a log cabin, busily writing on a small table by a kerosene lamp. It was night when we arrived. There was nothing in his appearance or surrounding which indicated his official rank. There were neither guards nor aides about him. He furnished us with comfortable quarters on board one of his dispatch boats. The more I became acquainted with him, the more I became thoroughly impressed with the very extraordinary combination of rare elements of character which he exhibited. During the time he met us frequently and conversed freely upon various subjects, not much upon our mission. I saw, however, very clearly that he was very anxious for the proposed conference to take place. The commissioner's note to Grant had been a substantial compliance with the requirement of President Lincoln, and so accepting it, the latter on the 31st of January sent Secretary Seward to meet them, giving him for this purpose the following written instructions. Executive Mansion, Washington, January 31, 1865. Honorable William H. Seward, Secretary of State. You will proceed to Fortress Monroe, Virginia, there to meet and informally confer with Messrs. Stevens, Hunter, and Campbell on the basis of my letter to F. P. Blair, Esquire, of January 18, 1865, a copy of which you have. You will make known to them that three things are indispensable, to wit, first, the restoration of the national authority throughout all the States. Second, no receding by the Executive of the United States on the slavery question from the position assumed thereon in the late annual message to Congress and in preceding documents. Third, no cessation of hostilities short of an end of the war, and the disbanding of all forces hostile to the government. You will inform them that all propositions of theirs not inconsistent with the above will be considered and passed upon in a spirit of sincere liberality. You will hear all they may choose to say, and report it to me. You will not assume to definitely consummate anything. Yours, etc., Abraham Lincoln. Mr. Seward started on the morning of February 1, and simultaneously with his departure, the President repeated to General Grant the monition which the Secretary of War had already sent him 2 days before through Major Eckert. Let nothing which is transpiring change, hinder, or delay your military movements or plans. Grant responded to the order, promising that no armistice should ensue, adding, "The troops are kept in readiness to move at the shortest notice if occasion should justify it." Major Eckert arrived while Mr. Seward was yet on his way. On informing the commissioners of the President's exact requirement, they replied by presenting Jefferson Davis's instruction. This was receding from the terms contained in their note to Grant, and Major Eckert promptly notified them that they could not proceed further unless they complied strictly with President Lincoln's terms. Thus, at 9:30 on the night of February 1, the mission of Stevens, Hunter, and Campbell was practically at an end. It was never explained why they took this course, for the next day they again changed their minds. The only conjecture which seems plausible is that they hoped to persuade General Grant to take some extraordinary and dictatorial step. One of them hints as much in a newspaper article written long after the war. "We had tried," he wrote, "to intimate to General Grant, before we reached Old Point, that a settlement generally satisfactory to both sides could be more easily effected through him and General Lee by an armistice than in any other way." The attempt was in vain. The general had indeed listened to them with great interest, and in their eagerness to convert him they had probably indulged in stronger phrases of repentance than they felt. About an hour after the commissioners refused Major Eckert's ultimatum, General Grant telegraphed the following to Secretary Stanton, from which it will be seen that at least 2 of the commissioners had declared to him their personal willingness to restore peace and union. February 1, 10:30 p.m., 1865. Hon. Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. Now that the interview between Major Eckert, under his written instructions, and Mr. Stevens and party has ended, I will state confidentially, but not officially, to become a matter of record, that I am convinced, upon conversation with Messrs. Stevens and Hunter, that their intentions are good, and their desire sincere to restore peace and union. I have not felt myself at liberty to express even views of my own, or to account for my reticency. This has placed me in an awkward position, which I could have avoided by not seeing them in the first instance. I fear now their going back without any expression from any one in authority will have a bad influence. At the same time, I recognize the difficulties in the way of receiving these informal commissioners at this time, and do not know what to recommend. I am sorry, however, that Mr. Lincoln cannot have an interview with the 2 named in this dispatch, if not all 3 now within our lines. Their letter to me was all that the President's instructions contemplated to secure their safe conduct if they had used the same language to Major Eckert. U.S. Grant, Lieutenant General. On the morning of February 2, President Lincoln went to the War Department, and, reading Major Eckert's report, was about to recall Mr. Seward by telegraph when Grant's dispatch was placed in his hands. The communication served to change his purpose. Resolving not to neglect the indications of sincerity here described, he immediately telegraphed in reply, "Say to the gentlemen I will meet them personally at Fortress Monroe as soon as I can get there." The commissioners by this time had decided to accept Mr. Lincoln's terms, which they did in writing to both Major Eckert and General Grant, and therefore were at once conveyed from General Grant's headquarters at City Point to Fort Monroe, where Mr. Lincoln joined Secretary Seward on the same night. On the morning of February 3, 1865, the rebel commissioners were conducted on board the River Queen, lying at anchor near Fort Monroe, where President Lincoln and Secretary Seward awaited them. And in the saloon of that steamer an informal conference of 4 hours' duration ensued. It was agreed beforehand that no writing or memorandum should be made at the time, so that the record of the interview remains only in the separate accounts which each of the rebel commissioners afterwards wrote out from memory, neither Mr. Seward nor President Lincoln ever having made any report in detail. Former personal acquaintance made the beginning easy and cordial through pleasant reminiscences of the past and mutual inquiries after friends. In a careful analysis of these reports, thus furnished by the Confederates themselves, the first striking feature is the difference of intention between the parties. It is apparent that Mr. Lincoln went, honestly and frankly, in all friendliness, to offer them the best terms he could to secure peace and reunion, but to abate no jot of official duty and personal dignity, while the main thought of the commissioners was to evade the express condition on which they had been admitted to conference, to seek to postpone the vital issue, and to propose an armistice by debating a mere juggling expedient against which they had, in a private agreement with one another, already committed themselves. Mr. Stevens began the discussion by asking whether there was no way of restoring the harmony and happiness of former days, to which Mr. Lincoln replied there was but one way that he knew of, and that was for those who were resisting the laws of the Union to cease that resistance. Mr. Stevens rejoined that they had been induced to believe that both parties might for a while leave their present strife in abeyance, and occupy themselves with some continental question till their anger should cool and accommodation become possible. Here Mr. Lincoln interposed promptly and frankly. "I suppose you refer to something that Mr. Blair has said. Now it is proper to state at the beginning that whatever he said was of his own accord, and without the least authority from me. When he applied for a passport to go to Richmond with certain ideas which he wished to make known to me, I told him flatly that I did not want to hear them. If he desired to go to Richmond of his own accord, I would give him a passport, but he had no authority to speak for me in any way whatever. When he returned and brought me Mr. Davis's letter, I gave him the one to which you alluded in your application for leave to cross the lines. I was always willing to hear propositions for peace on the conditions of this letter and on no other. The restoration of the Union is a sine qua non with me, and hence my instructions that no conference was to be held except upon that basis." Despite this express disavowal, Mr. Stephens persisted in believing that Mr. Lincoln had come with ulterior designs, and went on at considerable length to elaborate his idea of a joint Mexican expedition to be undertaken during an armistice and without a prior pledge of ultimate reunion. Such an expedition, he argued, would establish the right of self-government to all peoples on this continent against the dominion or control of any European power. Establishing this principle of the right of peoples to self-government would necessarily also establish, by logical sequence, the right of states to self-government, and, present passions being cooled, there would ensue an ocean-bound federal republic under the operation of this continental regulator, the ultimate absolute sovereignty of each state. His idea was that all the states might reasonably be expected very soon to return of their own accord to their former relations to the Union, just as they came together at first by their own consent and for their mutual interests. Others, too, would continue to join it in the future as they had in the past. This great law of the system would effect the same certain results in its organization as the law of gravitation in the material world. Mr. Stephens does not seem to have realized how comically absurd was his effort to convert President Lincoln to the doctrine of secession by this very transparent bit of cunning, and the others listened with considerate and patient gravity. Mr. Seward at length punctured the bubble with a few well-directed sentences, when Mr. Hunter also intervened to express his entire dissent from Mr. Stephens's proposal. In this view, reports Mr. Stephens naively, he expressed the joint opinion of the commissioners. Indeed, we had determined not to enter into any agreement that would require the Confederate arms to join in any invasion of Mexico. But the rebel vice president fails to record why, under these circumstances, he had opened this useless branch of the discussion. At this stage, President Lincoln brought back the conversation pointedly to the original object of the conference. He repeated that he could not entertain a proposition for an armistice on any terms while the great and vital question of reunion was undisposed of. That was the first question to be settled. He could enter into no treaty, convention, or stipulation or agreement with the Confederate States, jointly or separately, upon that or any other subject, but upon the basis first settled that the Union was to be restored. Any such agreement or stipulation would be a quasi-recognition of the States, then in arms, against the national government as a separate power. That he never could do. This branch of the discussion, also reports Judge Campbell, was closed by Mr. Lincoln, who answered that it could not be entertained, that there could be no war without the consent of Congress, and no treaty without the consent of the Senate of the United States, that he could make no treaty with the Confederate States because that would be a recognition of those States, and that this could not be done under any circumstances, that unless a settlement were made there would be danger that the quarrel would break out in the midst of the joint operations, that one party might unite with the common enemy to destroy the other, that he was determined to do nothing to suspend the operations for bringing the existing struggle to a close to attain any collateral end. Mr. Lincoln, in this part of the conversation, admitted that he had power to make a military convention, and that his arrangements under that might extend to settle several of the points mentioned, but others it could not. The theory of secession as a conservative principle, and the bait of a joint expedition to steal Mexico under guise of enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, being thus cleared away, the discussion turned to the only reasonable inquiry which remained. Judge Campbell asked how restoration could be effected if the Confederate States would consent, mentioning important questions such as the disbandment of the army, confiscation acts on both sides, the effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, representation in Congress, the division of Virginia, and so on, which would inevitably arise and require immediate adjustment. On these various topics much conversation ensued, which, even as briefly reported, is too long to be quoted entire. It will be more useful to condense, under specific headings, the substantial declarations and offers which the commissioners report Mr. Lincoln to have made. 1. Reconstruction. The shortest way the insurgents could effect this, he said, was by disbanding their armies and permitting the national authorities to resume their functions. Mr. Seward called attention to that phrase of his annual message where he had declared, in stating a single condition of peace, I mean simply to say that the war will cease on the part of the government whenever it shall have ceased on the part of those who began it. As to the rebel states being admitted to representation in Congress, Mr. Lincoln very promptly replied that his own individual opinion was they ought to be. He also thought they would be, but he could not enter into any stipulation upon the subject. His own opinion was that when the resistance ceased and the national authority was recognized, the states would be immediately restored to their practical relations to the Union. 2. Confiscation acts. Mr. Lincoln said that so far as the confiscation acts and other penal acts were concerned, their enforcement was left entirely with him, and on that point he was perfectly willing to be full and explicit, and on his assurance perfect reliance might be placed. He should exercise the power of the executive with the utmost liberality. As to all questions, says Judge Campbell's report, involving rights of property, the courts could determine them, and that Congress would no doubt be liberal in making restitution of confiscated property, or by indemnity, after the passions that had been excited by the war had been composed. 3. The Emancipation Proclamation. Mr. Lincoln said that was a judicial question. How the courts would decide it he did not know and could give no answer. His own opinion was that as the proclamation was a war measure and would have effect only from its being an exercise of the war power, as soon as the war ceased it would be inoperative for the future. It would be held to apply only to such slaves as had come under its operation while it was in active exercise. This was his individual opinion, but the courts might decide the other way and hold that it effectually emancipated all the slaves in the states to which it applied at the time. So far as he was concerned, he should leave it to the courts to decide. He never would change or modify the terms of the proclamation in the slightest particular. At another point in the conversation he said it was not his intention in the beginning to interfere with slavery in the States, that he never would have done it if he had not been compelled by necessity to do it to maintain the Union, that the subject presented many difficult and perplexing questions to him, that he had hesitated for some time and had resorted to this measure only when driven to it by public necessity, that he had been in favor of the general government prohibiting the extension of slavery into the territories, but did not think that the government possessed power over the subject in the States, except as a war measure, and that he had always himself been in favor of emancipation, but not immediate emancipation, even by the States. Many evils attending this appeared to him. Recurring once more to the subject of emancipation, he went on to say that he would be willing to be taxed to remunerate the Southern people for their slaves. He believed the people of the North were as responsible for slavery as the people of the South, and if the war should then cease with the voluntary abolition of slavery by the States, he should be in favor individually of the government paying a fair indemnity for the loss to the owners. He said he believed this feeling had an extensive existence at the North. He knew some who were in favor of an appropriation as high as $400 millions for this purpose. I could mention persons, said he, whose names would astonish you, who are willing to do this if the war shall now cease without further expense and with the abolition of slavery as stated. But on this subject he said he could give no assurance, enter into no stipulation. He barely expressed his own feelings and views and what he believed to be the views of others upon the subject. For the division of Virginia, Mr. Lincoln said he could only give an individual opinion, which was that Western Virginia would continue to be recognized as a separate state in the Union. 5. The 13th Amendment. Mr. Seward brought to the notice of the commissioners one topic which to them was new, namely that only a few days before, on the 31st of January, Congress had passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which, when ratified by 3/4 of the states, would effect an immediate abolition of slavery throughout the entire Union. The reports of the commissioners represent Mr. Seward as saying that if the South would submit and agree to immediate restoration, the restored states might yet defeat the ratification of this amendment, intimating that Congress had passed it under the predominance of revolutionary passion, which would abate on the termination of the war. It may well be doubted whether Mr. Seward stated the case as strongly as the commissioners intimate, since he himself, like Mr. Lincoln and his entire Cabinet, had favored the measure. It is probable that the commissioners allowed their own feelings and wishes to color too strongly the hypothesis he stated, and to interpret as a probability what he mentioned as only among the possible events of the future. It will be seen that in what he said upon these various propositions, Mr. Lincoln was always extremely careful to discriminate between what he was authorized under the Constitution to do as executive and what would devolve upon coordinate branches of the government under their own powers and limitations. With the utmost circumspection he pointed out the distinctions between his personal opinions and wishes and his official authority. More especially, however, did he repeat and emphasize the declaration that he would do none of the things mentioned or promised without a previous pledge of reunion and cessation of resistance. Even in case the Confederate States should entertain the proposition of a return to the Union, says Mr. Stevens's narrative, he persisted in asserting that he could not enter into any agreement upon this subject, reconstruction, or upon any other matters of that sort, with parties in arms against the Government. Mr. Hunter interposed, and in illustration of the propriety of the Executive entering into agreements with persons in arms against the acknowledged rightful public authority, referred to repeated instances of this character between Charles I of England and the people in arms against him. Mr. Lincoln, in reply to this, said, "I do not profess to be posted in history. On all such matters I will turn you over to Seward. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head." The pertinent retort reduced Mr. Hunter to his last rhetorical resource, a complaint that the Confederate States and their people were by these terms forced to unconditional surrender and submission. To this Mr. Seward replied with patience and dignity that no words like unconditional submission had been used, or any importing or justly implying degradation or humiliation even to the people of the Confederate States. Nor did he think that in yielding to the execution of the laws under the Constitution of the United States, with all its guarantees and securities for personal and political rights, as they might be declared to be by the courts, could be properly considered as unconditional submission to conquerors, or as having anything humiliating in it. The Southern people and the Southern States would be under the Constitution of the United States, with all their rights secured thereby, in the same way and through the same instrumentalities as the similar rights of the people of the other States were. The reader will recall that in his last annual message President Lincoln declared his belief, based on careful consideration of all the evidence accessible, that it was useless to attempt to negotiate with Jefferson Davis, but that the prospect would be better with his followers. Mr. Lincoln had evidently gone to Fort Monroe in hope of making some direct impression upon Stevens and Hunter, whom Grant represented as having such good intentions to restore peace and union. Seizing the proper opportunity, he pressed upon Stevens the suggestion of separate State action to bring about a discontinuance of hostilities. Addressing him, he said, "If I resided in Georgia with my present sentiments, I'll tell you what I would do if I were in your place. I would go home and get the governor of the State to call the legislature together and get them to recall all the State troops from the war. Elect senators and members to Congress and ratify this constitutional amendment prospectively so as to take effect, say, in 5 years. Such a ratification would be valid, in my opinion. I have looked into the subject and think such a prospective ratification would be valid. Whatever may have been the views of your people before the war, they must be convinced now that slavery is doomed. It cannot last long in any event, and the best course, it seems to me, for your public men to pursue would be to adopt such a policy as will avoid as far as possible the evils of immediate emancipation. This would be my course if I were in your place." The salutary advice was wasted. Mr. Stevens was a very incarnation of political paradoxes. Perhaps in all the South there was not another man whose personal desires were so moderate and correct, and whose political theories were so radical and wrong. At the beginning he had opposed secession as premature and foolish, war as desperate and ruinous, yet against his better judgment he had followed his cornerstone theory of slavery and his supremacy theory of states' rights to the war and the ruin he foretold. Now, at the end of 4 years' experiment, he still clung obstinately to his new theory of secession as a continental regulator, and the vain hope that Mr. Lincoln would yet adopt it. When at last the parties were separating with friendly handshakings, he asked Mr. Lincoln to reconsider the plan of an armistice on the basis of a Mexican expedition. "Well, Stevens," replied Mr. Lincoln, "I will reconsider it, but I do not think my mind will change." And so ended the Hampton Roads Conference. The commissioners returned to Richmond in great disappointment and communicated the failure of their efforts to Jefferson Davis, whose chagrin was as great as their own. They had all caught eagerly at the hope that this negotiation would somehow extricate them from the dilemmas and dangers whose crushing portent they realized, but had no power to avert except by surrender. And now, when this last hope failed them, they were doubly cast down. Campbell says he favored negotiations for peace, doubtless meaning by this language that he advocated the acceptance of the proffered terms. Stevens yet believed that Mr. Lincoln would be tempted by the Mexican scheme and would reconsider his decision. He therefore advised that the results of the meeting should be kept secret, and when the other commissioners and Davis refused to follow this advice, he gave up the Confederate cause as hopeless, withdrew from Richmond, abandoned the rebellion, and went into retirement. His signature to the brief public report of the commissioners stating the result of the Hampton Roads Conference was his last participation in the ill-starred enterprise. Davis took the only course open to him after refusing the honorable peace which Mr. Lincoln had tendered. He transmitted the commissioners' report to the rebel Congress with a brief and dry message stating that the enemy refused any terms except those the conqueror may grant, and then arranged as vigorous an effort as the circumstances permitted once more to fire the Southern heart. A public meeting was called, and on the evening of February 6, Jefferson Davis and others made speeches at the African Church, which, judging from the meager reports that were printed, were as denunciatory and bellicose as the bitterest Confederate could have wished. Davis particularly is represented to have excelled himself in defiant heroic. "Sooner than we should ever be united again," he said, "he would be willing to yield up everything he had on earth. If it were possible, he would sacrifice 1,000 lives," and further announced his confidence that they would yet compel the Yankees in less than 12 months to petition us for peace on our own terms. He denounced President Lincoln as His Majesty Abraham I, and said before the campaign was over he and Seward might find they had been speaking to their masters. This extravagant rhetoric would seem merely grotesque were it not embittered by the reflection that it was the signal which carried many additional thousands of brave soldiers to bloody graves in continuing a palpably hopeless military struggle. End of chapter 6.